Understanding the Temporality of Delay in Victorian Poetry. Welcome, Dr. Harrington.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda, for that really lovely introduction. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. Okay, there's the PowerPoint. Yeah, just so really grateful for all of you for coming today. This is a chapter from the book that I'm working on, and I'm really eager to hear what the Tennysonians think about this. So thanks so much for being here. It's really nice to see all of you. And my title is To Strive, to Seek, to Find, and to Yield, Waiting on Imperial Time in Tennyson's Enoch, Arden. If the mythological hero of Tennyson's early career, Ulysses, can refuse to yield, the working class striver of Tennyson's middle years, Enoch Arden, must yield. His story is the classic plot of bigamous return, as Maya McAlevey terms it, in which a sailor and husband goes abroad, is detained, often by shipwreck, and returns after many years to find his wife remarried. The plot line dramatizes the torture and tragedy of waiting. And here I'm going to give a little, I know many of you know the poem well, but I will give a little plot summary for those who don't or maybe forgot, along with these illustrations that kind of go from beginning to end. In Tennyson's long narrative poem, two boys, one poor, Enoch, pictured here on the rock, and one well-to-do, Philip, in the background, play together often with a girl, Annie, as children. As they grow up, Enoch wins Annie's heart and then works hard to buy a fishing boat so he can marry and support her. After an injury that prevents him from continuing to operate his fishing boat, Enoch takes a job as a bosun on a ship bound for China so that he can support his wife and children. Years go by after his departure, while Philip pays for the children to go to school, and after many years and much reluctance, Annie gives up her husband for dead and marries Philip. But Enoch is eventually rescued and returns to find his wife remarried. At the moment of the famous tableau vivant of the new family in the window, and that's the black and white picture that you see there, Enoch then heroically, in the view of the poem, resolves never to tell Annie that he has returned. He dies shortly thereafter. The townspeople figure out who he was, and Annie and Philip put on a lavish funeral. Although Tennyson presents his decision not to tell them of his return as heroic, that choice too yields his dream of domestic prosperity to his rival. At the source of this tale of heartbreak and loss, this sentimental drama, is financial need, which arises because Enoch, a fisherman, is injured aboard a boat. The offer of a job in the global shipping trade presents itself as the solution to this problem. Of course, the venture ends in shipwreck, and Tennyson thereby conveys some ambivalence about global trade, capitalism, and imperialism as a viable solution for local precarity. Far from expediting prosperity, the global economy expands and disrupts temporality, not only for Enoch, stranded on a tropical island, but also for the characters who never leave his quaint British fishing village. In short, global capitalism makes everyone in the story wait. Jeffrey Auerbach makes a similar case about imperialism broadly, arguing, contrary to an assumption that imperial overseas experience brought excitement and adventure, that imperialists from the generals down to the lowliest functionaries and sailors experienced an extraordinary newfound boredom, an emotion often associated with waiting. Enoch Arden certainly experiences the kind of boredom Auerbach describes, but his tedious wait causes his wife and his friend to wait, suggesting that the effects of imperial boredom and waiting reverberate at home. That waiting produces much psychological and aesthetic interest for Tennyson, and for the 19th century more broadly, in a new kind of experience of endurance without sure hope of a goal, without sure hope that the achievement of the goal will bring satisfaction, a narrative in which nothing much happens. This important mid-career poem depicts waiting as punishment for domestic striving that is forced out onto the global stage. In Tennyson's early poems about setting out, action is identified with Europe and the West. whereas rest is identified with the east, with warmer and less temperate climates. That rest is often action's reward, and yet it also threatens to engulf the men who let themselves succumb to its temptations, like the lotus eaters. In poems about travel to warmer places, action and rest are in internal tension within a man. It is important to note that these places are not specific, but are identifiably tropical, connoting colonial or colonizable territories to the British, but not evoking any exact country. The men of the Lotus Eaters, pictured here, and Locksley Hall, want to relax, but not to the point of waiting and passivity. In these early decades of Tennyson's poetry, it's the women who wait, like the famous Mariana in the Moated Grange. The men, at least, are represented as being able to do something about their passivity. A woman relies on someone else's actions to free her from her weight. Enoch Arden changes that gendered calculation so that waiting becomes a frightening experience for men, whereby a waiting man is feminized by virtue of his powerlessness to act. Climate plays an important role in Tennyson's fears and desires about temporality. By the time of Enoch Arden, both the prerogative to act and ordered, predictable temporality belong in Tennyson's mind to the temperate climates of the North, if not to the downright British landscape, to seasons that change in the cycles of deciduous trees. Global trade brings new climates, new temporalities, disrupting the reliable British order that most of Tennyson's traveling protagonists ultimately crave. But it's not just the traveling characters who suffer from these changes. Enoch's departure disrupts his family's temporality as the consequences of global ambition seep into the domestic and reshapes its temporalities as well. The sort of tropical island which seems at once appealing and threatening in the Lotus Eaters becomes torture in Enoch Arden because it deprives him of the possibility for action, which he specifically pursues in order to raise the wealth needed to improve his family's social standing to give them, quote, a better bringing up. Because Enoch seeks that goal, that social standing in global trade, domestic family success, nation, and climate become identified with each other as he waits. Jed Esty has argued that, quote, modern imperialism violated national historical time and set capitalism loose across the globe in ways that would come to disturb, and indeed still do disturb, our dreams of inevitable yet measured human progress. Esty looks at disruptions to the development of self in would-be Bildungsromans of the late Victorian and early modernist periods. But with Enoch Arden, and even with earlier poems that present rest as the modality of regions to the east and south of Britain, the disruption to temporality with travel on a global scale becomes clear. That expanded temporality upended and remade white European families by making them wait for each other. Waiting finds its poetics as well. The blank verse from Enoch Arden represents that uncertain temporality, constituting what Matthew Campbell calls, quote, a Tennysonian poetic of postponement. At the same time, blank verse is recognized both as particularly English, often the prosody of choice for epic genres in English. The association with national identity and the heroism that comes with epic suggests an imperial ideology at the heart of it. Yet its formal open-endedness with variable lengths of verse paragraphs and sentences, thanks to enjambment and lack of rhyme, allows for the poetics of procrastination and postponement that Campbell points to. Enoch Arden, then, if it is not narratively satisfying and does not narrate fulfillment of the promise of global and imperial trade, is at least poetically satisfying, embodying the tension between action and rest, global and local. The cross purposes of blank verse signal how, in Enoch Arden, global ambition fuels personal tragedy. So this is the second section. It's mostly about Annie. Bide your year. A waiting wife loses seasonal time. Although, as Kirsty Blair notes, Enoch Arden was no favorite of critics and scholars, it was enormously popular, selling 17,000 copies on the first day and 60,000 in the first year. After they note how few scholars study it, relative to Tennyson's other work and relative to the poem's extraordinary popularity, most critics who consider Enoch Arden focus on the end, with its stunning tableau vivant in which Enoch, the sailor who promised to return to his wife and children, returns after more than 10 years, only to stare into the lit window on his family, his own position replaced by his childhood friend Philip, who has a new baby on his lap. The lavish funeral that Philip and Annie arranged for Enoch caused quite a stir among Tennyson's contemporaries because they asked, was it meant to compensate for the bigamy? But the tableau vivant remains of perpetual interest for the way that it both establishes and unsettles patriarchal domesticity. Yet, this persistent focus on the end of the poem comes at the cost of attention to the middle, which is what interests me because that is where the waiting happens. All the focus on the end occludes the fact that, as Christopher Ricks points out, the poem does not seem narratively very exciting and has, quote, an equivocal relationship to narrative as such. For providence on the one hand and not acting on the other between them absorb almost all the narrative. This insight that the poem's narrative consists in primarily not acting is not a literary fault, though. That seemingly actionless middle importantly reveals ideas about time and power. What looks only like providence to Ricks might also be read as systemic forces of social class, burgeoning global economy, and the growing British Empire. But Enoch's departure and Annie's remarriage are determined by financial need. This need provides the nexus of imperial and domestic in the poem, the political and the psychological. While these external forces govern their decisions and their fates, the characters also grapple mentally and emotionally with the disorientation of stasis within an expanded timescale. Rick's observation also reveals the seemingly oxymoronic narrative power of waiting in maintaining the tension rather than moving from event to event. The animating suspense of the poem lies in the tension between the incapacity for action and the fervent wish for a result. For all three protagonists, the waiting middle contains abundant hope, with almost no possibility for action in order to realize that hope. Waiting is almost the only action available, except to Annie, who must choose whether or not to give up Enoch for dead and marry Philip. Even for her, waiting seems preferable for most of the poem. Although, as Humphreys points out, the poem is more emotionally invested in Enoch, the passage focusing on Annie's wait and her delay in agreeing to marry Philip reveals how the experience of waiting can alter what counts as a long time. Her wait would end, of course, with Enoch's arrival or news of his death. But without control of those events, Annie can only wait. For Annie, waiting is action, but one that has no effect on the goal. We do not see Annie's internal state, either in her own words or in a kind of free and direct discourse, but we are privy to her conversations with Philip, in which she begs him to wait. She tells him that he can only ever be second in her heart to Enoch, and he consents to be, quote, loved a little after Enoch. We can see her fear and indecision alongside his resignation. Oh, she cried, scared as it were, dear Philip, wait a while. If Enoch comes, but Enoch will not come. Yet wait a year is not so long. Surely I shall be wiser in a year. Oh, wait a little. Philip sadly said, Annie, as I have waited all my life, I well may wait a little. Nay, she cried, I am bound, you have my promise, in a year. Will you not bide your year, as I bide mine? And Philip answered, I will bide my year. This passage questions relative time, or how long is long. As Annie says, a year is not so long, but she does set an expectation for something to be different at the end of that year. Her delay allows another year for Enoch to return, but even as she offers this as a reason that she asserts Enoch will not come. If she does not expect any definitive news or Enoch himself, then what wisdom does she look for? A decisiveness within? This vague idea that she will be wiser seems to reach out for some change within, or evidence that she also seems fairly certain will not materialize. Philip does not seem to agree that a year will bring a difference either in tangible evidence or in internal state, but he does agree that, relatively speaking, a year is not long. He has longed for Annie since he was a child, so each increment of waiting is small, even as those increments accrue to a longer and longer total interval for him. The difference is evident even in their punctuation. Where Annie lengthens time here by means of em dashes, Philip shortens it in the elision of answered. The word bide, appearing 3 times in these 2 lines, is practically a synonym for wait. And indeed, the line, will you not bide your year as I bide mine, is cited as an example of the first definition in the Oxford English Dictionary as an intransitive verb, meaning to remain in expectation, to wait, often with an adverbial adjunct of time. It is both a subtle and a monumental distinction from the transitive definition, to wait for, await, now only in the phrase to bide one's time, to await one's opportunity. Time on this transitive reading is not a substrate, but an event, an object, a moment, an opportunity, a recognizable turning point. In the intransitive verb bide, as Annie and Philip use it, time is a duration, a medium, or a measurement in which the action of biding takes place. Whether to, quote, bide a wee, from the OED example from Walter Scott, or bide a bit, in the OED example from Charles Dickens. Ripe Time Pending, this is my book manuscript, will take us through that distinction. As we move from chapter to chapter, the object seems less and less clear, while the experience of duration matters more and more. Already for Tennyson here, the experience of duration has its own value separate from the object. Here, the object of the waits for Annie or Enoch or Philip seem clear enough: individual, interconnected, and contradictory. Enoch's return, a rescue, a yes to a marriage proposal. Yet Annie presents waiting here as having a benefit of its own. Some wisdom, maybe an extra measure of certainty. Too much time has passed for her to rely on the arrival of any specific moment. Her biding has no syntactical direct object. She bides during a year, a month, 6 months, and for the 10 years preceding the moment when she tells Philip that they will both bide a year. They will have to endure the time that passes. Importantly, the term remain appears in this definition of bide, a term that denotes stillness and steadfastness. In order to avoid the moral censure of bigamy, Annie must wait and make Philip wait. Her wait proves her love and devotion to Enoch, a devotion displaced not by her reluctant decision to accept Philip's proposal, but by her devotion to the baby she has with Philip after their marriage. Before the baby's birth, she is jumpy, nervous at every sound of a footstep, afraid to be alone, even after her marriage until, quote, then the new mother came about her heart. Then her good Philip was her all in all, and that mysterious instinct wholly died. When Annie suggests that a year is not so long, and that at the end of a year she might be wiser, she gets at 2 key problems in waiting. First, how do you measure the time of the wait? What counts as a long time or a short time? And how does one's perspective shape the concept of the length of time? And 2, how do you know when to wait and when to act? How do you recognize the knowledge when it comes? What counts as knowledge, and what is an intuition or a hunch? The year to Annie feels so short that it feels like a flash. For her, waiting makes the time move fast and feels short, because at this point she is imposing a wait on Philip and wants to extend the wait as long as possible to give Enoch a chance to come home. Her own wish to extend the wait makes time fly by for her. She spoke, and in one moment, as it were, while yet she went about her household ways, even as she dwelt upon his latest words, that he had loved her longer than she knew, that autumn into autumn flashed again, and there he stood once more before her face, claiming her promise. Is it a year? She asked. Yes, if the nuts, he said, be ripe again. Come out and see. But she put him off. So much to look to, such a change. A month. Give her a month. She knew that she was bound. A month, no more. Then Philip, with his eyes full of that lifelong hunger and his voice shaking a little like a drunkard's hand. Take your own time, Annie. Take your own time. Previously, Annie tells Philip that she is bound to him within a year. In this new verse paragraph, the narrator puts her speech from just the previous line, I am bound, into the past tense, narratively moving time forward even as Annie mentally remains in stasis. The verbs that describe her actions, went, dwelt, also in past tense, keep the reader in a kind of ordered grammatical time while Annie stays in one moment, as it were. Annie's activities, both mental and physical, taking care of household duties and dwelling on Philip's steadfast love for her, are but subordinate clauses in the sentence of her moment, in which the primary action is the flash of the autumn when she makes her promise to Philip, and the subsequent autumn when she is set to deliver it. Yet she is not attuned to the passage of the year. This interval of waiting creates competing timescales. Annie's wish to stop time until Enoch's return competes with Philip's long-standing desire and patience. Annie and Philip use possessives to claim units of time for each of them. Annie refers to my year and yours. Philip says he will bide my year. And then after he bides that year, he tells Annie to take your own time. They present time as subjective and personal rather than shared. Waiting isolates them from each other, which is arguably Annie's goal in response to her isolation from Enoch. The increased time and distance of Enoch's voyage and shipwreck overpower and undo the local seasonal signs that tell them what time they are in. Annie and Philip's individual timescales both become uncomfortably measured against predictable and regular natural cycles. Philip tries to measure time by the ripeness of the nuts, assuring a doubtful Annie that a year has passed. Importantly, autumn becomes the measure of seasonal shifting and changing here, the beginning of a dormant period as opposed to the renewing, growing changes of spring. In temperate climates, autumn and winter are their own kind of seasonal wait, one with an object and an end that could not be more predictable, at least back then. These characters from a temperate climate are accustomed to cycles of waiting and fruition, experiencing the dramatic loss of leaves and green followed by their regrowth, as well as the autumn harvest that provides for the dormant period of winter. Autumn is what Enoch misses most on his tropical island, suggesting that what is most unbearable to him is the stasis of his wait, its unpredictability, its powerlessness, loneliness, and boredom. Those, I will suggest, are to Tennyson the most threatening features of the tropical landscape, which offer a static, powerless, unpredictable wait. That kind of waiting is one cost of the empire and global trade, and one that, as we see in the case of Annie and Philip, disrupts timescales in Britain as well as abroad. Annie's failure to notice that nutting season has arrived again signals the intrusion of what Tennyson must have perceived as a more static climactic experience, where Enoch spends his time passively waiting into the, to him, more ordered and predictable timing of the British climate. This focus on Philip's adherence to the timing of the natural cycles of their seaside village, in contrast with Annie's forgetting of it, sets up a dichotomy in which the northern climate creates ordered timing, in which delimited waiting is to be expected, and can be productive even, while the tropical climate represents a kind of chaotic stasis and open-ended waiting. Annie delays and delays with the patient Philip, and not even the mean gossip of the little village can move her. Finally, she opens her Bible at random to look for a sign of whether or not Enoch is alive. She reads the phrase, "under a palm tree," deems it meaningless, but then dreams of Enoch in heaven. Of course, readers can guess well enough, and suspicions are confirmed soon enough that he is on a desert island. Whereas Annie reads the palm tree as a kind of heavenly stasis, it in fact signifies not only the literal palm trees on Enoch's island, but also the way that Enoch experiences tropical landscape as one of stasis, of a kind of overbearing, stifling heat, and even an overabundance of vegetation and life. Ironically, she reads the tropical tree in the Bible as a sign to end her own wait and to marry Philip, while in the context of the poem, it signifies Enoch's literal location as well as the figurative stasis of his own wait. Annie, in her wait, has the privilege both of ending it, albeit not as she had hoped, and of feeling as though some undefinable wisdom has been gained in the process, or at least an assurance of her loyalty to Enoch in having endured so long. All right, here, this is the section about Enoch. Soft fruitage, mighty nuts, stasis and plenitude. Because action and escape are impossible, Enoch's island is a prison of waiting, even though it has most, if not all, of the ingredients for an island like the Lotus Eaters or for the tropical paradise that the Speaker of Locksley Hall fantasizes about. Following the foundering of his ship returning from China to Britain, Enoch and two fellow seafarers land on a desert island. In a standard colonial fantasy reminiscent of Robinson Crusoe before Friday appears, the place is conveniently uninhabited and also abundant with resources to sustain human life. Yet it does not manage to sustain two of the three castaways who land there, and its very plenteousness, and especially implicitly its tropical locale, seem vaguely threatening. No want was there of human sustenance, soft fruitage, mighty nuts, and nourishing roots. Nor save for pity was it hard to take the helpless life so wild that it was tame. There in a seaward-gazing mountain gorge they built, and thatched with leaves of palm a hut, half native cavern. So the three set in this Eden of all plenteousness dwelt with eternal summer, ill content. For one, the youngest, hardly more than a boy, hurt in that night of sudden ruin and wreck, lay lingering out a 5 years' death in life. They could not leave him. After he was gone, the two remaining found a fallen stem, and Enoch's comrade, careless of himself, fire hollowing this in Indian fashion, fell sun-stricken, and that other lived alone. In those two deaths, he read God's warning. Wait. The presence of the divine is all around Enoch in this world. Reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, the island seems to be made to support human and other animal life, and yet no people live there. Tennyson provides a landscape of abundance on Enoch's tropical island. It is deserted, but not a desert. Even the line describing the food overflows with syllable and stress, with a spondy in the first position and an anapest in the last. If hazelnuts are the marker of seasonal cycles back in Enoch's northern fishing village, the island instead has mighty nuts to mark its eternal summer. These coconuts, the words imply, might seem disturbingly large to Enoch, who longs for the small hazelnuts of home, whose trees provided shade for Enoch and Annie's courtship. Enoch cannot enjoy this Eden, but that is less because he misses his family than because he misses his climate and the natural environment he's accustomed to. Even the hunting is easy, because the animals they would eat have no other natural predators. The helpless life so wild that it was tame. The only reason not to catch and kill these creatures is pity. This peaceful coexistence is not a state to be aspired to, however, but to be feared for the absence of action and even aggression. Barbara Barrow discusses the wide variation in the significance of animals in Tennyson, especially in Maud, a poem from around the same time as Enoch Arden. But whether they are brutish or expressive on her reading, they are seldom so tame as they are on Enoch's island, where they are not themselves and have never encountered predators. Tennyson's ambivalent attitude towards such a state of seemingly bucolic peace is evident in his word choice, the helpless life so wild that it was tame. These beasts are poor suckers, not enlightened vegetarians. They do not fit Barrow's account of animals as often savage in Tennyson's poetry, nor do they fit a model of the primitive, which she argues Tennyson associates with violence. Instead, the strange tameness of the animals on Enoch's island fit into an idea of the stasis of the East that Beatrice Russell finds in Savary's Turk, placidly enjoying nature and without need for action. Their brand of tranquil, rather than predatory wildness, resembles the waiting Enoch must endure, and is at once appealing and threatening because it threatens to eliminate the ambition of the predatory. By presenting the animal's placidity as wild, the poem suggests predation is civilized. Given that Enoch's financial need drove him to participate in an imperial global economy, this presentation of the predatory as human rather than animal highlights Tennyson's ambivalence about the imperial global economy, his longing for its ambition and fulfillment coexisting with his awareness of its dangers. The animals on Enoch's island seem to have reached an ideal peace that is still unavailable to Enoch and unavailable to the West because European civilization is founded on predatory action. That very need for action, rather than satisfaction with placidity, makes waiting so unbearable for Enoch. The island, with a nature that does not need human taming, seems ripe for colonial plunder, but these British sailors have no appetite for that. Whatever desire for gain that they had when they left home devolves into a mere desire to return. Despite the Eden of all plenteousness and the eternal summer, the British sailors are ill-content. The youngest one takes 5 years to die from his injuries sustained in the shipwreck. He is waiting to die during this time, lingering out a 5 years' death in life. Even the rich resources of this tropical paradise cannot revive him, and during this time, Enoch and the other remaining sailor are also waiting for him to die. Presumably, the comrade who dies of sunstroke worked himself to death to make a boat out of a log to escape the island. But Enoch feels the presence of a Christian God here, who turns his friends into cautions and instructs him to wait. It would seem that the very condition of waiting, in spite of abundant resources, saps their energy. Certainly they miss home and family, but the inability to take action towards progress makes them desperately unhappy. Rather than offering the pleasures of inaction that Russell finds in some of Tennyson's early poems like The Lotus Eaters, here waiting is a curse, even though for Enoch it is practically an instruction from God. Isolation from family and the utter inability to take action to reunite with them seems like the most obvious source of pain in the story. But Tennyson's poem spends more lines on the landscape of Enoch's isolation than on the emotional deprivation of it. The island landscape itself seems like an instrument of torture, enforcing a temporal stasis in its lack of recognizable seasons, and reminding him of the very absence of the northern landscape with its deciduous trees and hazelwood shade. Enoch Arden's binary view of nature, which reads as a divide between northern climates and southern ones, emerges in Tennyson's son's memoir of him, where he describes Tennyson's pleasure at thinking of nature as ordered and his apprehension at the thought of its uncontrolled spread. And this is Tennyson's son's memoir. As he exulted in the wilder aspects of nature, see, for instance, section 15 of In Memoriam, and reveled in the thunderstorm, so he felt a joy in her orderliness. He felt a rest in her steadfastness, patient progress and hopefulness. The same seasons ever returned, the same stars wheeled in their courses. The flowers and trees blossomed, and the birds and yearly in their appointed months. But he was occasionally much troubled with the intellectual problem of the apparent profusion and waste of life, and by the vast amount of sin and suffering throughout the world, for these seemed to militate against the idea of an omnipotent and all-loving Father. Quote, the lavish profusion, too, in the natural world appalls me, from the growths of the tropical forest to the capacity of man to multiply, the torrent of babies. According to Hallam Tennyson's account, Tennyson's apprehension at the lavish profusion of the tropical forest leads him to question his faith. His fear at over-reproduction across all species, plant, animal, and human, going so far as to present an accumulation of human lives as a kind of natural disaster, implicitly maps onto a landscape far to the south of Britain, much like the one which traps Enoch. This fear, then, is not just of different natural modalities, of whether, as in the famous passage in Memoriam, nature protects the individual or the species, but of which regions of the planet merit the assignation of godly natural order, and which have a frightening wildness that goes beyond that of a familiar thunderstorm. This passage begins to clarify how the soft fruit and mighty nuts might seem part of a threatening profusion rather than orderly, steadfast, and making patient progress. It's important that the word patient is coupled with progress here, for simple patience without forward motion might be more like a tolerance of the proliferation that turns into waste. Northerliness and progress are coupled in Tennyson's perception of natural temporal order, which depends on the seasons of deciduous trees, the return of birds that migrate away from cold weather, and a period of dormancy followed by renewal. The idea that European landscapes are ordered, while tropical ones have a chaotic, monotonous plenitude, whose abundance signals waste rather than forward motion, is borne out in Enoch Arden, where the British seaside village can recognize its seasons by the stages of the wild nut trees, and the tropical island measures its days only in a blaze coming from a different direction. Enoch Arden participates in the climate unconscious that Philip Steer identifies in British regional realist novels, which place, quote, annual seasonal progression at the center of temporality, plot, and character, relying on a logic of predictability and periodic recurrence. Tennyson's depiction of a tropical landscape of monotonous profusion disrupts Enoch's and Tennyson's northern idea of order. His account of tropical landscape seems like it is almost designed for prolonged, unpredictable waiting, a waste of time, lacking the kind of foreseeable change, renewal, and growth that the British Enoch is familiar with. In Enoch Arden, natural profusion, nourishing yet threatening, accompanies emotional deprivation. Certainly, Enoch misses his family, but their absence is just among a list of the familiar things he misses. Enoch spends every day on the beach looking for another ship. Tennyson focuses Enoch's nearly unbearable solitude, the absence of any other human voice or face, but illustrates the anguish of that void by filling it with the sounds of the island, which Tennyson depicts as menacing. The myriad shriek of wheeling ocean fowl, the league-long roller thundering the reef, the moving whisper of huge trees that branched and blossomed in the zenith, or the sweep of some precipitous rivulet to the wave. As down the shore he ranged, or all day long, sat often in the seaward gazing gorge, a shipwrecked sailor, waiting for a sail. No sail from day to day, but every day, the sunrise broken into scarlet shafts among the palms and ferns and precipices. The blaze upon the waters to the east, the blaze upon his island overhead, the blaze upon the waters to the west. Then the great stars that globed themselves in heaven, the hollower bellowing ocean, and again the scarlet of sunrise, but no sail. The anaphora of the blaze and the unstinting prosodic regularity of those lines underscores that the changing position of the sun in the sky is really no change at all, but rather part of the dull, rhythmic monotony of the island. Without even a change of seasons, this tropical landscape, as Tennyson portrays it, has a monotonous stillness. Even the constant motion of the sounds in the wind and the water and the birds remind him of the lack of human differentiation. Enoch's own experience of waiting is externalized onto the landscape, and this landscape is menacing as much as his own home landscape is comforting. He does think about Annie and his children, not to imagine how they might be now, but to remember them. In his memory, they are merely part of the whole environment of home. A phantom made of many phantoms moved before him, haunting him, or he himself moved haunting people, things, places, known far in a darker isle beyond the line. The babes, their babble, Annie, the small house, the climbing street, the mill, the leafy lanes, the peacock yew tree and the lonely hall, the horse he drove, the boat he sold, the chill November dawns and dewy, glooming downs, the gentle shower, the smell of dying leaves, and the low moan of leaden-colored seas. Annie and the babies, plural, not even separate, are numbered among the phantoms he sees as he looks out at the ocean for a sail. Readers who are moved by his exclusion from the family tableau of the ending would do well to remember that during his wait, his loved ones are but a part of a composite phantom of home that includes buildings, streets, trees, and a notably different sort of sunrise than the ones he experiences on the island. The foggy softness and coolness of that idealized autumn British landscape contrasts sharply with the repeated blazing of the island sun. This contrast signifies the way his spatial stasis becomes temporal stasis, which is arguably as upsetting to him, as represented here, as his separation from his family. Tennyson represents his tropical island as a fundamentally synchronic landscape, while he casts his home as diachronic and full of activity. Enoch's situation is reminiscent of Mariana and of Fatima, who is a kind of Eastern Mariana. He is waiting for rescue, feminized by the powerlessness of his waiting state. Yet the lover that Enoch waits for is not Annie, herself in a Mariana-esque position waiting for him, unable to rescue him, but Britain itself, whose physique, or rather landscape, Enoch pines for while he is away. Rather like a wife, Enoch trusted in the British Empire to protect him and to increase his wealth, but like Mariana's and Fatima's lovers, it abandoned him. His devotion to Britain appears in the way that he idealizes the landscape while trapped on the tropical island, and in the way he folds family into climate in the phantoms he misses. The callous, uncaring, abandoning force in Enoch Arden is Britain, which encourages economic and political colonization, needing low-level participants in the global economy to make it function. Britain does not return that devotion, leaving behind any recruits who become casualties of the system. It is significant that the sailors who rescue him are not British and do not speak English. His own nation has left him behind. As Blair notes, he has virtually no chance to be integrated into his small community when he returns home, and he is estranged from, if not abandoned by them. Given the extent to which in his own waiting, Enoch is also subject to maddening repetition, to hallucination, wishing for his beloved wife and perhaps his even more beloved landscape, only to find himself replaced when he finally returns home. The similarities with Fatima and Mariana feminize Enoch as a, quote, passive, patient hero, as Blair refers to him. Enoch is both abandoning and abandoned, having left his wife behind against her better judgment, and now abandoned by his community and nation. The very thought that the shipping company, much less the British Empire, would have bothered to discover his fate and attempt to report it to his family does not even come up. The imperative towards global trade has left Enoch without his family, without his homeland and its familiar landscape, without his nation, without his sense of temporal order, and without even, perhaps, his masculinity. Enoch Arden suggests that the spatial expansion of global trade and empire creates the potential for temporal expansion, for being made to wait, which is too costly to the relatively powerless people recruited into that system. Written 20 years after the early poems of Imperial Imagination, Enoch Arden comes at a time when, Sherwood writes, Tennyson's and the public's interest in the British Empire was reignited. As both Sherwood and Cornelia Parasol document, Tennyson is about to enter a stage in his career when he valorized the British Empire as politically unified. Why, if Tennyson is becoming increasingly vocal about his support for the empire, does he write a poem suggesting that Britain is indifferent and disloyal, if not outright destructive, to its most quietly aspiring subjects? Christopher Kierstead's investigation of literal space in Tennyson's mid-career poetry provides one answer in Tennyson's ambivalence about the seaside and seafaring in the poet's work, particularly when it comes to characters who are regular people rather than mythical figures. Kierstead argues that while Tennyson may have valorized the empire as an abstract principle or in the context of mythological characters, those ideas foundered when he approached actual travel. As Ulysses argues, waiting is not for real heroes. Enoch's ambitions were ultimately small, the financial stability of his family, but they ran into an expansiveness of time and space that undid his domestic aspirations. Thanks.